All right, good afternoon, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. So today, I just want to give everybody a bit of a heads up as to what we're doing. We are going to cover the rest of monopolistic competition, which falls together with oligopoly in chapter 10, and that'll be the last of the market structures. Remember, we have 4 market structures, and we're in the part of the class we're talking about structure on the supply side, on the firm side of things, and so. We're going to finish up monopolistic competition and talk a bit more about that, because we just really started to begin that discussion on Monday. And then we're going to do chapter 11, which is actually a fairly brief chapter. I know the chapter itself is a lot lengthier than what I'm going to cover, mostly because it gets into some specifics that I think are not really necessary for what we're doing here. And I don't want to focus so much on the legal aspects as I do the economic aspects. So we'll cover that. If there's any part of this we don't get to next time, it'll be just a fragment that we carry over into next week, and we'll start to really then be sort of in the home stretch really from where we are, because this is week 9, and I guess next week is week 10, and I forgot to put on there. So but let's finish up this discussion here. Remember, and I want to sort of circle back to this idea that we have these 4 market structures: perfect competition, which was discussed in chapter 8, chapter 9 covered monopoly. Chapters 10 and 11 cover monopolistic competition and oligopoly. And for whatever reason, textbooks don't often separate these last 2, but put these last 2 together. And I'm not 100% sure why. I know that when I was a reviewer on one of the texts that a lot of us said, why not break those up and make those separate? Because they really are separate market structures. It's sort of wrong to have people think that they kind of go together like, ham and bacon or salt and pepper. I mean, they're just really not the same. But nonetheless, maybe because there's not as much to talk about in oligopoly or monopolistic competition, I don't personally buy that. But the thing that we should know, once again, is the idea that these last 3 together constitute what we would refer to as imperfect competition. And it's more simply us saying, okay, well, it is what it's not, or these are what they're not. It's more an issue of marginal revenue being quite different than what we see in perfect competition. That's really the key divider. One of the key issues, along with other issues like barriers to entry, economic profit possibilities in the short run and the long run. So what did we say about perfect competition? We said in perfect competition that economic profit was possible in the short run, but in the long run it was practically zero, just because of the fact that there were low entry barriers. Lots of firms could come in and take advantage of the situation. And one of the things that I think we're seeing right now is the market for eggs. And I sort of didn't pick up on this right away. And I had a number of students in a number of classes who kept talking about the price of eggs. And I guess since I don't buy eggs myself, I was sort of not thinking much about it. But like that egg price is what, $4, $5 a dozen. And so I really started to look into this some more. And to me, it's a market that is almost the definition of perfect competition. Production side, maybe not for the distribution side, because there are about 7 or 8 firms that really constitute what we would think of as oligopoly. Different part of the supply chain, but over the weekend I was doing some research and I found there's some 19,000 egg producers in the country, and they could get together and rig the price of eggs. And some people are sort of alleging it's really a double whammy. And I talked a bit about this on Monday. The double whammy of higher demand for eggs. Generally, it's been going on for years, because it's a substitute for meat as a protein substitute, and meat is obviously very expensive for all kinds of reasons at the moment, and it has been for a long time. And also supply got shrunk because of the fact that there was a flu that was going on and killing off a large percentage of poultry that lay egg-laying poultry. So demand shift was sort of pushing things this direction, and a supply shift pushing this direction. So what's going to happen is I have no doubt that the price of eggs will return. In fact, I was in the store last night and I saw eggs for $2.57 a dozen. So we're already starting to see some pushback, because what happens? They simply produce more. I mean, it doesn't take that long to produce more eggs. And as a result, we will return back to equilibrium. I think we're already starting to see that happen, to the point where we'll get back to just what we call a normal accounting profit. That is just a profit that allows them to succeed and earn a normal rate of return, but not an economic profit. That is accounting for opportunity costs, simply because of the fact that, and by the way, we're starting to see imported eggs come in as importers are trying to grab a piece of that market share at higher price. Prices already begun to fall. And so in these markets that are perfectly competitive, we see that happening. In monopoly, it's just the opposite. Where there's no competition, you don't have to fear competition. because of the fact that there's no competitor coming in, or if there is, they're very small. And by the way, before we end the class today, we'll talk about some of the measurement, and we'll see why it just becomes so insurmountable. If the demonstration of economies of scale from the natural monopoly discussion last time wasn't enough, and we'll sort of get into a bit of the measurement that the government uses to try to track what we call industry concentration. That is market power being concentrated in fewer and fewer producers' hands. Okay, so that was monopoly. We said the perfect that profit is not guaranteed, but is the norm. Not guaranteed, but is the norm in the short run and in the long run. Now we move to monopolistic competition, and we just barely got into this last time. So again, I've been presenting this monopoly and perfect competition, and I know that sounds like a paradox because we've sort of presented perfect competition and monopoly as complete opposites. Good twin, evil twin, whatever, however you want to think about North Pole, South Pole, and yet we've got this hybrid of both. So how does this work? How do you have a hybrid of two things that are opposites? Well, we have the fact that there's monopolistic pricing possibilities in the short run, but in the long run, we say that it sort of diverts and sort of breaks down to perfect competition. So we're saying it's a hybrid of both. Okay, so and last time, I think as far as we got last time, was just the description of some of the characteristics of monopolistic competition. And let me see if I can bring this up here. Well, we said that many sellers exist, and I know we went over this. So, and I posted these slides last night so you can see for yourself these, and it goes into the discussion in chapter 11 as well. So it carries us through this week. Ease of entry and exit. So far, this looks like perfect competition, doesn't it? Many sellers, but also many buyers too. I mean, it's something that we probably don't stress enough. There are a lot of buyers, lots of sellers in both perfect competition and monopolistic competition. But here's where it starts to break away from just a purely perfectly competitive, bang each other's heads in kind of market, rock'em sock'em kind of thing. This is where product differentiation makes a big difference, and it's achieved through branding. And for those of you who like marketing and will go on to study marketing and whatnot, or work in marketing, you'll see that supporting the brand is such an important part of the management of a business firm. Making sure your brand is strong, because a lot of the products, frankly, that are made aren't really that much different than the other products. In fact, they would be perfectly competitive were it not for the brand itself. But branding does a lot of things for us, and I think it's important that we understand what brands are all about. I'll talk just a bit more. I think I've got some more information there coming up in the next slide. I think about brands. Try to look ahead here and think if I talked about this in the slide package. Let me see here. Yeah, I'll talk more about it. So brands are a key factor here, and defending the brand. And we talked about this idea that if you order Coke in a restaurant, there's only Pepsi products. They'll always say, "Is Pepsi okay?" Right? Because of the fact that Coke is defending its brand and has agents out in the field, quite literally, to make sure that nobody is representing Pepsi as Coke because it's the brand. Pepsi and Coke are pretty much the same thing. I mean, I know that a lot of people think they can tell the difference, but in reality, what Coke discovered to its horror was the fact that people really couldn't tell the difference. And that's why they came up with a different product back in the early 80s. And it was I guess it was mid 80s. It was a wild failure. It just fills the annals of marketing journals about messing with the brand. So don't mess with the brand. That's the key takeaway. So the pricing power, which is what gives us the monopolistic element, is in direct proportion to the brand strength. The stronger the brand, the more price inelastic demand will be. And so what is a firm trying to do? To take a demand curve and to try to make it a little steeper. That is, they can put some pricing power into it, put a little oomph into it. So if you can make people think the good is unique, faster, cheaper, well, maybe not cheaper, but is a better product, higher quality, maybe lasts longer, is qualitatively superior to all the other substitutes out there, then you can get brand loyalty going on. And we know brand loyalty exists. And the question is why? What do brands do for us? What is it that we like about brands? Because I think that the research into consumer behavior as it relates to goods at the retail level, people shopping, is that they tend to act in very similar ways, which is why back in chapter 6, we talked about a consumption bundle. We felt fairly confident in saying that a consumption bundle is maybe different from consumer to consumer, but it's unique to each individual consumer, but that's pretty consistent within that consumer. And by the way, it's also multi-generational. Okay? So if your parents were likely to use Tide detergent, you're probably more likely to use it. Not guaranteed, but you're more likely to use it. There's a multi-generational aspect of it. Arm & Hammer baking soda, all these kinds of things which sort of lead us to to have it. And what it really does for us. What do you think brands do for us? Why do you respond to brands? Why do I respond to brands? Well, what do you think it does for us? Anybody? Yeah, maybe it's a qualitative aspect. It's a quality, perhaps it's higher quality, and sometimes it is. And frankly, I think that's a good justification. It's quality, but it's also a consistency. You know exactly what you're getting. And so, in other words, it gives us consumption insurance. It gives us insurance so we know exactly what we're getting. And I talked about the example last time about, I believe it was the Budweiser production run that there's some imperfection, and they ended up just destroying the entire batch. Even though they probably could have sold it and maybe had zero complaints, they didn't want to take the risk of messing with the brand, because probably somebody would have noticed it, and then they would have, maybe it would have resulted in some sort of inquiry, and that was just too much to risk. Too much to risk. Okay, so what are some other characteristics? They're often protected by copyrights, patents, trademarks. So we talked about this before, okay? When we talked about monopoly barriers to entry, and one of those were these legal protections, and all of these are legal protections. Copyrights, which are things like the brand, like the slogan that might go along with that particular brand. That's maybe more of a trademark. But copyrights are things like particularly intellectual property, things like formulas and secret formulas and whatnot, even though it's hard to keep a secret today. Patents, to the extent that patents exist on certain brands. I'm thinking particularly the drug industry that has patents on drugs for X number of years. And trademarks. And trademarks can be things like slogans, logos, where they cannot be reproduced, and so as a result, if you are making t-shirts and you try to produce a Lobos t-shirt and sell it without the Lobos passing judgment on it and approving it and taking a piece of the action of it, then you're probably in violation of whatever trademark that the New Mexico Lobos have. I presume that they do, because most schools do, most teams of any kind, of any size do. Most goods have some sort of trademark. And there's some logos that are very popular, like the Coca-Cola logo. They'll trademark the logo, and they'll also trademark the reverse image of it, so as to prevent people from stealing that for their own particular uses. And they'll defend these aggressively, and they'll go after these a theft of these particular items. And I can tell you that just one example that I can remember in my experience, which sort of seemed to me to be overkill and almost like Big Brother, the big guy clobbering the little guy. And that was when I was in college. I went to a college town, and there was a local ice cream store. They had a number of locations. This is in Bloomington, Indiana, and they had a product called the Blizzard. They had it for years. It was just an ice cream product they called the Blizzard. And then shortly after, Dairy Queen came out with its product called Blizzard, and they ended up trademarking that name. They got the rights to that name. And so then they went to this firm and said, hey, you can't use the word Blizzard, the name Blizzard. We own the name Blizzard. And they said, well, we've had it for years. We've had it since like the 1920s or something. They said, it doesn't matter. You don't have the rights to the name. Blizzard belongs to us. So they had to change it to Blizzard with a T or something like that. And it was a big deal. And everyone was thinking, wow, Dairy Queen's really coming down hard. But they have to do it because if you can't have everybody selling quarter pounders, because those are McDonald's products. I mean, that's what we all know McDonald's has. Everybody knows what some of these firms have in terms of their products, and they don't want to be confused that, well, where do I get a quarter pounder? If you can get a quarter pounder at Wendy's and Burger King, then it's not really a quarter pounder if it's not unique to McDonald's, for instance. And the same goes with the Blizzard product. And they were simply acting maybe it seemed like heavy-handedness, but they were doing it because it's really the fact that as I understand it, if a firm does not defend those intellectual property rights, they are inherently giving up the right to those. So you have to defend them, and if you don't take proactive steps to defend them, you're implicitly giving up the right to those rights. And the reason for that is the fact that brands come and go sometimes. Sometimes they die off, and the brand name no longer exists, and so it becomes fair game to anybody who wants to use it. And there have been cases in which people have revived the names of brands by completely different firms altogether. The original firm is defunct, it's out of business, nobody cares. And so they're sort of rejuvenating the brand once again. Okay. So this aggressive defense of brands is a big important thing. I think I also told the class about the fact that the NFL, really came down hard on one of my customers when I was in commercial lenders because she was showing the NFL games without getting their express written consent. And you always hear that on football games, the express written consent of the NFL, right? Or Major League Baseball or NBA, right? It's because of the fact you can't show them for commercial purposes without their approval and without cutting on some of the revenue that is being made because it's their product. And there's only one NFL, there's only one NBA, et cetera. So, this sort of what seems like hand-to-hand in this is really an attempt to defend the brand. And by the way, the commissioner of football, Roger Goodell, has said that his main job is defending the shield. The shield is the logo for the NFL. He calls it defending the shield. And that's what he thinks his main job is to defend the brand and to make sure that, nothing interferes with the image that the NFL has. And this is why they go after players who act ugly out in public and, censure them and kick them out and suspend them, even though they may not have committed a violation of the law. They are trying to make the image of the NFL look a little bit acceptable, I guess is the word, to the general public. But that's an example. I mean, these are just clear examples, but this by no means are these isolated examples. This crosses the field of any kind of operation that has monopolistic pricing in the short run and the ability to have monopolistic types of characteristics. And by the way, we're saying this is a short run proposition that ultimately these brands will fade, with the exception of some, and we'll get to those in a second. And they're a very small sliver. So again, one of the distinguishing characteristics of all these structures that are non-perfectly competitive are this negative price effect of rapidly diminishing marginal revenue. That is, if you make the product more available, you simply reduce the scarcity value, and as a result, the price has to come down because, again, nobody's outlawed the law of demand, and that is, if people have demand for the good, and you make it totally available, then it no longer has scarcity value. So this idea of the marginal revenue curve lying to the left of the demand curve is a feature, excuse me, all the way through monopolistic, imperfectly competitive structures. Okay, so the negative price effect is a thing. We can go over that again if you like. So short-run economic profit is possible in the short run. Now here is a bit of a caveat when it comes to this idea of the short run, because what is the short run and what is the long run? And it's really hard to know here when the short run is and when the short run ends and when the long run begins. And it's really not a case in which it's obvious as to when these happen. But at some point, we're going to say that because there's monopoly pricing, which is where the term monopolistic fits into this definition, for as long as they're able to charge prices that are above the perfectly competitive price, then they can earn short-run economic profit. But we're saying in the long run, the profit is considered to be zero because what happens? That some brands break down over time. They become no longer as profitable, and as a result, we see that it will fade off into oblivion. And we've seen brands come and go, and it happens all the time. And by the way, you might be thinking, well, because there are a lot of brands that we know that we buy that have been around forever. And you just mentioned the fact that we've got multi-generational nature. And that is true, but there are brands that we call super brands that have been around forever, and they are just really indestructible. But the vast majority of brands come and go. And that we know that because of people who track brands. There are a lot of brands that we see out there, and some are fairly weak. Just take things like the soft drink space. Okay, let's just take where we talked about particular structure of that particular industry. Yes, you've got Coke and Pepsi, but you've got brands that have been strong at times and no longer are really even there. And I can remember as a kid, we had brands like Bubble Up. That's no longer around. Royal Crown Cola, which is still around, but is I think about the only place I've seen it is Walmart, although you may be able to find it elsewhere. That was a much stronger brand than what it is today. Today, it's really hard to find. You can't find an RC machine today, whereas back in the day, we did. There were all kinds of other cola brands, and think about things like Fanta. That's a fairly weak brand. It's been around. Shasta, fairly weak brand. Canada Dry, a much stronger brand, but different sorts of products. So you get the idea that lots and lots and lots of brands, and some of them have come and they've gone. Fago, I don't even think Fago is even made anymore. These are brands that were once out there. They just simply fade away because of the fact that they go away. Take something like cigarettes. This is a really interesting market because cigarette branding is everything. Cigarettes. Now, I know that people who smoke really are very, very loyal to their brands. I mean, they're just extremely loyal. And I know that my parents' generation, which is sort of this World War II generation, a lot of them like non-filtered Lucky Strikes. In fact, a lot of people who were in the military around that time, Lucky Strike cigarettes were what was given out. I know my dad had got Lucky Strike. He started smoking in the Army. They told him it's good for you to smoke. If you can believe that, it's good for you to smoke. It calms your nerves. Like, I can't think of anything more ridiculous, but it calms your nerves. And so he started smoking, and Lucky Strikes were his brand. I don't know anybody who smokes Lucky Strike cigarettes. I'm sure they're made. I don't smoke myself, but I'm sure they're made. But those are brands that have simply gone away. They just really doesn't really exist anymore. Marlboro being a strong brand, some of the others that are out there, but those will probably fade off into oblivion as well. Winston used to be a strong brand, maybe not quite as much anymore. And the fact is that a lot fewer people smoke today than what they used to. And so, I mean, smoking is pretty much forbidden pretty much everywhere. I mean, you used to be able to smoke on airplanes. I mean, I can't imagine anything crazier than allowing that to happen today. So we're saying economic profit breaks down to be zero in the long run. So zero profit equilibrium is this long run condition in these industries that becomes then very similar to perfect competition, with the exception of these so-called super brands. So let's talk about these super brands, and let's talk about what some of the characteristics are of these. And there are really two characteristics. Number one, they've got staying power because people attached to the brand. It's got something maybe a little bit different, a little twist on the brand that people all sort of know and they like, and it's easy to remember. They've got snappy names, Glad trash bags, right? Things like that. Bounty paper towels. These are not different. I mean, Glad paper trash bags are probably not superior to any other brand of trash bag necessarily, except yes, I know there are really, really cheap generics. If it's really, really inexpensive, there is a qualitative difference, as you mentioned. But these are brands that have got staying power. Also, one other characteristic of it is that the name of these goods oftentimes is synonymous for all goods in that category. All goods in that category we use the name of the brand as shorthand for all goods in that category. Kleenex. Do you have a Kleenex? If somebody gives you a Puffs, do you care that it's a Puffs? Oh my God, don't give me that. I want a Kleenex, right? But it's a Kleenex, right? A Coke. Let's go get a Coke, right? Whether you end up getting a Sprite or an iced tea makes no difference. It's almost the name that we use for that particular brand. Xerox, which is frankly not as strong a name. But in fact, legal papers used to have the term xerography for copies. That is, if you make a photocopy, it was called a xerography because Xerox was the brand, the only brand of copier for a long time when they had really sort of the first real copier that everybody could have in offices. And so make a Xerox. We don't really hear that term that much anymore. Again, owing to the nature of the fact that sometimes these super brands themselves can lose a bit of power. There are other examples, Reynolds Wrap, Saran Wrap. We usually refer to these particular goods as being for all the particular goods in that category. And these are goods that have got staying power because we simply latch onto them and we know what they are, and they don't go away over time. And because of this, by the way, in marketing, maybe these firms don't even have necessarily the pricing power they once had. But there's a concept in marketing that says, look, these are what we consider to be the dogs, right? They're dogs because they're not growing. There aren't a whole lot of people, there's not a whole lot of extra demand for Arm & Hammer baking soda. Been around for generations. I can't even tell you how long Arm & Hammer baking soda has been around. Demand is not really growing, but why not keep offering it as a brand? Because people are still buying it, you're still making money. And by the way, this is more of an accounting issue. All the equipment that's used to make it has probably long ago been depreciated off the books. And it's just a matter of cranking out Arm & Hammer baking soda. Even if your margins are fairly thin, they're probably fatter than are the generic substitutes for that particular good. It's just a brand that just won't go away. And they do try to advertise it for different uses. They tried a few years ago to really advertise it as a toothpaste substitute. And I don't think most people really glommed onto that. So then they decided they'd come out with their own toothpaste because I think it was kind of disgusting for people to brush their teeth with baking soda. I have never done it myself, so I can't tell you what that's like, but I don't know if anybody ever has, but to me, that just seems kind of wrong and weird. But you get the idea that these super brands, they have a lot of life. They can go away, but they tend not to. So Coca-Cola is probably one of the strongest brands in the world. And I know there was a study done several years ago about, and it was by linguists, frankly, about what is the most common word on earth. And that crosses cultures and languages. And I guess the word okay was number one. Okay. Now you can travel all over the world. I was in an airport in Japan and the security people could say, okay. Everyone just kept saying okay, right? Everyone knows what okay means. And the second was Coke. Everyone knows Coca-Cola. And I thought that was very interesting. You're talking about a brand of a good made in the United States it's been around since 97? Been around for a very long time. That is a super brand if anyone ever thought of it. And so this is why Coke went to such great lengths to try to keep Pepsi down and keep them off the shelves to the extent that they could, but people like Pepsi product. And I think that there was a desire to want competition in that market, because here's the thing, and this is going to be a segue into what we're going to get into in chapter 11, is that we value competition in this country. That we really don't like monopolistic practices, and so as a result, we inherently push back against them. Now, maybe this is a uniquely American thing. I don't know, because there are other parts of the world that don't have such an aversion to monopolies. And I bring up Japan again because I think it's a perfect example where the Japanese is part of Japanese society and their legal customs where they're not quite as uncomfortable with monopolies, and they're also not quite as uncomfortable with this whole idea of what we call vertical integration, that is taking goods from the raw material to intermediate good to wholesale to retail, all of that distribution, everything. They're not to be here, but we're much more uncomfortable with what we call horizontal integration, which is across the market, and we definitely are more. We'll tolerate some vertical integration. That is, that goes all the way from the early stages to the final product. When it comes to what we call horizontal integration across the market, and I'll get into this a bit more in chapter 11. That's when we start to have some real issues, and we get into some regulatory concerns, and some of that's coming up in what we will refer to as the antitrust part of this. Okay, and so then one thing is that the profit maximizing quantity is equivalent to the point at which the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. Okay, or marginal revenue equals marginal cost is the sweet spot here. And again, and I'll just bring the lights up here just a bit here, just to sort of reiterate what is going on here with monopolistic competition, is the idea that a firm will do this very same thing in the short run as what they'll do in monopoly. So again, when we talk about this idea of perfect competition, remember, in perfect competition, the price is set where supply and demand come together. Remember, the marginal cost curve and the supply curve are equivalent. So the competitive quantity is here, and the competitive price is here. But all firms in all industries, and by the way, in perfect competition, demand and marginal revenue are the same. So there's no conflict here because marginal cost equals marginal revenue. That's the point at which all producers in all industries will produce. But marginal revenue breaks away here because of the fact that there's a need not to overproduce the good in imperfectly competitive markets so as to try to maintain some economic profit, because all you do is drive the price down. By driving the price down, you drive the marginal revenue down. But here, firms will produce at the output level in which marginal revenue is marginal cost, okay? So we have this monopolistic quantity and monopolistic price. So the same issue goes here as it does with monopoly, at least in the short run. And all the other issues that come about, higher price, lower quantity, creation of a dead weight loss, which is that sort of a dead zone, that the output is less than optimal, and the price being given up is less than optimal, particularly for the demand side. But some of the losses also accrue to the supply side because they're also not producing additional revenue, and all the other societal benefits that come from producing additional revenue, like labor and wages that are being paid, taxes that are being paid. And so this is why we say this is sort of a dead zone that exists whenever we have a situation of a monopolistic situation. But here's the thing, in the long run, what is the issue here? We're saying that the economic profit is possible in the long run But we're saying it's considered to be zero because of two things happening. Number one, the brand loses its brand appeal and the price falls. And as the price falls, we get back to something closer to perfect competition. The other thing is the introduction of new brands. As new brands come in, they push out old brands. And this is why we've seen, and I bring up the cola market where there used to be many more dominant players, and it turns out that new brands came in and sort of pushed those brands out. And so to the extent that they're still around, I suspect they're still around because the cost of producing it is so infinitesimal compared to whatever price people are willing to pay. That's why they probably are hanging around. They don't have much market share, tiny, tiny, tiny market share. And we're going to see what impact that has when we measure what's called market power, market concentration. So the first thing is brand power loses strength. And also new firms come in, and as they do, what does it end up doing? It brings, whenever there's a supply shift, new suppliers are coming in, it ends up driving the price down, right? The price goes down even while the quantity goes up. And those are two factors that both work against monopoly pricing. Those are two things that monopolies do not want, or any firm that would presume to have monopolistic pricing, even in the very short run, they don't want that, okay? In perfect competition, this happens much faster. And so in the market for eggs, we've only been talking about eggs for a few weeks now, and we're already starting to see the price fall. Why? Very low barriers to entry, right? Extremely low barriers. And so now eggs are coming online. The avian flu is mostly dealt with, I think. I'm not far from an expert on that. But we know that there are more eggs coming on the market, so the price is falling. But that's perfectly a competitive market. It takes a little bit longer, a longer adjustment period, and people are a little bit more reluctant to give up their brand. But some brands come in and they force out other brands. And as a result, we simply accept those new brands for whatever particular reason, and we adopt them. And the number of goods just goes, you know, I mean, we could go hundreds and thousands of goods across the economy where we see this kind of thing happen. We can hold on to it for the very short period, but over time, it's going to be taken away. The only exception is these super brands, and that we're saying that they will have some end of life at some point, but we just don't know when. And maybe not in our lifetimes, you know, and if it's not in our lifetimes, then I don't know that we really care when Coca-Cola will go away. Maybe it will never go away, but you know, it would be one of the very, very few exceptions of goods that have an indefinite life. And we've seen this across the market. Look at automobiles, the brands of automobiles. Now, I know that for a lot of years, the auto industry is considered to be oligopolistic for reasons that we'll get to in a second. But over time, I think we're starting to look at it more as a monopolistically competitive market because there's so many brands of cars out there today, whereas there didn't used to be decades ago. But as a result, we've seen car brands go away, vanish, not exist. These are big, big firms with big employers, and yet they've gone away. Names like Pontiac and Oldsmobile and Mercury. These are brands that have been around for a long time, and yet have vanished simply because of the fact that other brands have pushed them out. Okay, so this is sort of the issue here, and I've already thrown out some names of some examples of some of these. Oops, let me grab my remote here. Of some of these firms that are in monopolistic competition, but I want to throw out some others here so that we know what's going on, just so that we've got a better feel for this. And so what are some other examples here? We're talking about things like consumer packaged goods. I think that's probably number one on the list here, because when we talk about brands, that's really one of the biggies there. It's not that firms don't respond to brands, and firms tend to respond more to price than they do brands often. And other things like quality and if it's a bigger ticket item, they want things like service and maintenance and warranties and things that may or may not a lot of consumer goods, particularly small packaged goods that we don't buy a bottle of shampoo and worry about a warranty or even the quality. I mean, or the maintenance. There's no maintenance and there's no warranty and there's no installation. We're not concerned about that. We're not concerned that there's no back end on that. We just simply buy a bottle of shampoo. It's done. And so as a result of that, firms don't have quite the same connection to brands as does the household sector of the economy. But there are exceptions. There certainly are. So consumer packaged goods are almost the epitome here of goods which we see on the shelves in stores all the time. And by the way, I talked a bit about this on Monday. One of the examples of a firm that has just been absolutely dominant in consumer packaged goods is Procter & Gamble, which has been around since the 1850s. It's a very old company, one of the very first consumer packaged goods companies, and they were known as a soap company for a lot of years because they had Tide and Sheer and all these brands. You might wonder, well, why do they have all these particular brands? Because you might think, well, why don't they just sell Tide? Why not just make that? And the answer is, well, first of all, people like a little bit of variety, like choice, and also these are considered to be down market brands. Tide is considered to be the premier brand, and there's other down market brands. And they're not alone in the idea of having up market and down market types of goods. You see it in beverages all the time, particularly in the brewing market. We get high quality beer and lower quality beer and all that. Same with packaged goods. But also there's another strategic aspect, and that is the more brands you put on shelves is you keep other brands off shelf space. Shelf space is everything when it comes to marketing. Keep the other goods off. And firms will go to great lengths to try to maintain vertical and horizontal strength across the brand. That is, we want to keep sellers' goods off the shelves, even if it means we take lower margins on some of the lower quality brands. All, for instance, as detergent is less expensive than Tide, simply because it's a lower quality brand. And that's an example of this particular kind of marketing where they try to sort of dominate the market. Even though there's competition, they try to dominate that by dominating shelf space, and they've been masters at that. And by the way, P&G, they have a long history of having these brands compete against each other. And they have separate brand managers who compete against each other as if they were different companies. They think it gives them strength. They think their own internal culture they feel that it gives them strength when they're competing against each other because they can survive on their own. But more importantly, they keep others off the shelves. Not that there are others that don't make the shelves, but they really dominate that market, no question about it, have forever. And people latch on to things like detergent for whatever reason. And the price of detergent, it's not an inexpensive good at all. I would imagine the markups are pretty significant. If you know what detergent is, there's not much really to it at all. So you get the idea of monopolistic practice could last for a very long time. Designer apparel, as opposed to more generic goods, there's no question this has appeal to a lot of buyers. But the fact of the matter is these goods come and go, and that they don't have long staying power very often. But we don't see some of the brands in apparel that were once popular years ago. They simply come, they go, they come and go. And London Fog used to be a very prominent name, not so much anymore. Calvin Klein jeans, not so much anymore. We don't see that. Even Levi's, which were what everybody when I was a kid wore, and not so much anymore. I mean, you get the idea. These brands didn't lose power. Adidas was once an apparel which was very strong, and then Nike kind of came in and ate Adidas lunch. And I know Adidas, they've sort of made a bit of a resurgence, but Nike completely, again, talking about the emergence of new brands, came in, and then they forced everybody sort of to the side, and then they began to raise price dramatically. And so you get the idea of designer apparel, the length of time they can be out there. And I would imagine at some point Nike will be sort of forced out of the market as some other new players come in. And I suspect that it'll be at some point, it will happen. It just takes a little bit of an adjustment time because buyers have got to get acclimated. Cosmetics and perfumes, no question. Sporting goods, I could attest that sporting goods, a lot of people will be very loyal to the particular brand of sporting good that they buy. I played baseball all the way through high school and college, and I can tell you that in softball, when I became an adult, everybody who buys baseball mitts will buy the same brand, usually over their entire lifetime. And I know that baseball is not a game you play into old age, but you get the idea that these are people are particularly loyal to particular brands of sporting goods. Hotels and motels, this is a little bit trickier, and I'm a little bit reluctant to go with this, but there's definitely branding there, and the firms have sort of made it that way because of rewards programs and discounts and credit card offers and other linkages with things like rental cars and flights. They've really tried to make themselves brands just simply because there's so many of these competitors out there that they want to try to build loyalty somehow. And they're all doing it. By the way, what's the difference between a hotel and a motel? Does anybody have the definition of what that is? Because I don't know that there's an official definition, but anybody know what the difference is between a hotel and motel? Well, I don't either, other than the fact that I can tell you what I've heard. There's the hotels, the doors open to the inside, the motels, the doors open to the outside. That's the only main difference that I have heard of. Also, motels I thought are sort of a play on the word hotel, with the idea of being a motor lodge. That is where you can stop overnight, particularly if you're traveling and it's not your destination. You're just staying there for the night. You're not, going to go on vacation and stay in a Motel 6 for a week in Topeka, maybe that's not your destination. Maybe someplace else is. So you get the idea, right? Insurance is very definitely a branded product, and we don't often think about it, but this is one also where there's a multi-generational nature of this, and that is people will sort of stick with insurance year after year after year. And in fact, a lot of times we'll hand this on to their kids if they will use it. I know my dad, had certain insurance. When I got my first car, I had the same insurance company he did. Eventually, I changed and went my own direction, but that's another product where we sort of latch onto the brand, even though there's absolutely no difference between insurance companies. And by the way, when it comes to almost any kind of financial company, they're almost all identical. And the reason is the products are so heavily regulated, there's really not much differentiation. I know that, and I was in banking for a lot of years, and I know these firms talk a good game about how we're different, but they're not really different. They're all pretty much the same. State Farm is pretty much the same as Allstate. It's the same as Progressive. It's the same as, you name it, right? The same goes with banks. They're all pretty much the same. And so even though they try to create brands, and people do latch onto them, but also just like the hotels and motels, they also try to make it very difficult for you to leave. And I can tell you that and this is where Wells Fargo got tripped up with their sort of cross-selling scandal, because there's been a lot of research that shows more products you have with somebody, the less likely you are to leave in the financial world. So if you've got so back to car insurance, we have car insurance, life insurance, auto insurance, homeowners, you're probably less likely to leave if somebody angers you on the telephone or whatever. Same goes with banking. And by the way, bankers are notorious for making their customers angry. I can't think of an industry that has messed up customer relations more than banking. But the more you lock people into the product, the more you get them to buy your brand and stay with it. Okay. Also, especially retailers that focus on one particular good. We all know these goods. There's nobody here who doesn't know what these goods are. We know exactly what Starbucks offers, what Sunglass offers. All of these are ones that but we don't think about going to Dippin' Dots to get a fish sandwich, right? We know exactly what they offer because this is their identity. This is what we know of them. And then any kind of franchise retail operation, for the most part, the reason that franchising works is because of the fact they're leveraging off the brand. It wouldn't work if there was no brand to lever off of. You have to have a brand, because otherwise there's no point in having some other party run the operation. That's what a franchise really is have some other party take over distribution and take over the ownership of that distribution. And it doesn't work if you don't have some kind of brand to pass off to that party, whatever it is. We think of fast food as being an example, but it's a lot of other examples as well. Things like tools, like Matco tools and whatnot. These are retail operations, and as an example of those. And there are others as well, like sometimes some kind of plumbing operations, like Roto-Rooter. Some of these are franchised operations. Okay, so that kind of does it for monopolistic competition. Again, a few things that can weaken it and cause the short run to sort of devolve in the long run, and that is the brand becomes weaker, and so therefore they can't command monopoly pricing. If that brand strength is losing, and then new firms coming in that push out existing brands, and by definition it forces the price down and the quantity up, and so people don't have to buy the particular good. They have monopoly power, and they're all too willing to buy the new good. And I think a lot of consumers are very willing to adopt new brands if they see them as being qualitatively superior, and if there's a price differential that gives them a reason to do that. And again, we're going to return to a theme. Again and again, that's the idea that we value competition on the supply side. It is part of our culture. We like competition in the U.S., almost to the point where we value competition over efficiency. And we'll get to that issue. We'd be like it all the way into chapter 11 today, but we'll do our best, okay? All right, so any questions about monopolistic competition before we move on to the fourth and final category here? Anybody on the Zoom call have any questions? Well, okay. Well, let's move into the last structure of the oligopoly. In my mind, this is one of the most interesting structures, really. Even though we are all familiar with the goods that are produced in monopolistic competition, this hybrid structure that is differentiated over time frame. But oligopoly, we also know these producers as well, because what we're really talking about here is big business, an industry where it's got less to do with the good and more to do with just the simple number of competitors. And that's really the issue here. It's a market structure characterized by only a few firms supplying the bulk of the quantity in the market. Now, when we say a few, what do we mean by a few? And that's a good question. Well, it's got to be more than one, because otherwise it would be a pure monopoly, right? So it's going to be two. And in fact, a market with two suppliers is a very special market we call a duopoly. And when two suppliers provide the bulk of the output in the market, you have a separate sort of dynamic that game theorists have worked out for years. The fact that for many years, Coke and Pepsi were really the two big, strong brands. And that was almost the epitome of a duopolistic market. Today, there aren't that many duopolies I can think of, except maybe Boeing and Airbus, maybe. And those are goods that, you sort of latch onto one or the other. There's not a lot of back and forth going on there, but you get the idea. So it's two to maybe a dozen. Maybe a dozen would be the outer limit of that. In fact, a dozen might be too high. In fact, I could easily see, economists don't always agree on everything, as you might sort of imagine just instinctively, but maybe I could see it where people would say a dozen is too many. Some would maybe say 8, but we're saying a few. So we're going to leave that a little bit vague by definition. It's not the actual number, though, that really matters. What matters more is how dominant any individual firm or groups of firms are in relation to the others. We're going to talk about how we measure that. There's a very specific way by which we measure that. So it doesn't really matter the number, although I will say that there is sort of a magic number of 4 that sort of keeps coming up again and again and again. We'll talk about that a bit later. Okay. All right. So what are some characteristics of oligopolies? All right. So let's go through these. What are some of the things that are things to know? Okay. Okay. So we say, first of all, that firms in this industry are considered to be what we call strategically interdependent. That is, their existence is intertwined with the others. And because there are only a few competitors, they're watching each other very closely, very closely. They pay attention to what goes on. And I can just give you an example of this in markets in which there are only a few banks, for instance. Banks watch each other, watch the product offerings, even though they're the same, they're watching things like rates, and they're trying to match them, because this is an area where it's not about the price and not about the product really at all. It's about the number of firms there, and they're watching each other very, very closely. And we'll give some examples of what's going on here. The strategic interdependence is the idea that if something happens to one firm, it tends to happen to the other firm as well. This is why there's this weird relationship that firms have with each other in this industry. And that is they're competitors. And we want to make clear that they're competitors, and they're often intense. In fact, often the competition is fierce. But yet sometimes they band together when their collective interests are threatened, particularly by government or by lawsuits. And they will oftentimes form trade associations in order to protect themselves against things like regulation. And just as an example of this, if you think about any kind of advertising, which you see, don't let Congress do this, it's usually some trade organization getting together and saying, look, we got to stop Congress from doing that. Like maybe maybe milk providers, the distributors themselves might get together in a certain area and say, don't let the state government prevent new dairies from going in. A lot of people don't like dairies coming into their or dairy cattle operations, coming in because of all the environmental issues with that. But so they're strategically interdependent in so many ways. Also, there are some issues here. Along with this is sort of a subset of this, and that is the strategic dynamic is that often, not always, but of a leading firm and following firms. And what do we mean by leading and following? We mean that if one firm does something, and it's often, but I know the textbooks will often refer to it as price, but almost always, because that's really the easiest way to understand it, is one firm does something with price, everyone else follows suit with price. It's almost like there's a green light. If one firm changes the price, everybody changes the price, and they all change it instantaneously right away. The best example of that's the airline industry. The airline industry has only got a few competitors. Really, there aren't very many. In fact, there are fewer and fewer airlines than there were just 10 or 20 years ago. Look at the number of airlines that have gone out of business altogether because of the fact that the industry is shrinking in terms of numbers of competitors. TWA is no longer around. US Air is no longer really around. They're part of American, I believe. Northwest Airlines is no longer around. I think they're part of United, maybe? So United, American, Southwest, and I think Delta, those are the big airlines that exist. And we often sometimes push Southwest off into a separate category altogether because their business model is a little bit different, but you can include them now if they're a big enough player. But what's the issue of leading and following? And the airline industry is almost a perfect example. And that is, if one firm changes fares between New York and LA everybody changes fares immediately, right away, instantaneously. If they lower the fares, it's not just raising the fares, lowering the fares too. Everybody will do it at the same time. So if you want any proof of that, go on to Priceline or Expedia or any of these travel sites and put in an itinerary. Just put in, just fake some, going anywhere. So you're flying to New York, and you'll see not a close price, but the exact same dollar figure for United, for Delta, for American, all the way across the line. Now, obviously, if it's a weird time of day or if it's very close to the travel date, then maybe all bets are off. But if it's, say a month out, just put it in for a month out. It'll be identical price on the various airlines. Why? Because all airlines are basically the same. It's a very standardized product, and there is really very little. And I've flown all the airlines in this country. I mean, except for maybe the smaller ones. And I've flown a lot of the international ones, and I don't think there's any difference. I can't tell you any difference at all. In fact, there are times in which I've had a layover where I forget what airline I'm on. I'm going to look at my ticket and think, what am I? I forget, right? So, it's because it's the same thing. And that's the fact that they all sort of are in the same boat together, and they're strategically interdependent because people really don't perceive a difference between them, which is why Southwest started out to be different. And they sort of got a little bit goofy with their product offerings at one point when they were a much smaller firm. They were giving bottles of whiskey to travelers, which today I think you probably couldn't get away with. They were just doing fun things, on their airline. Most airlines are not particularly fun, and especially since 9/11, fun is sort of banned on airlines. I've seen people thrown off aircraft and whatnot. But that's a perfect example of leading and following. And as one firm changes the price, and others do it. But it's also not just that; it's also the form of the product. One firm changes the form of the product, and everybody else changes the form of its product as well. Maybe it's due to a lawsuit. Maybe there's something that one particular good is found to be a little bit dangerous, and so as a result, a modification is made, so everyone else changes and modifies their product because they're watching what each other is doing. Another example would be of the form of the product. Think about this. Broadcasting is very much an oligopolistic market. Think about the providers of let's say television, okay? Radio is a little bit more, it's a little bit more perfectly competitive, frankly. Not as much money in radio, tons of radio stations, just lots of small radio stations, no bigger than this room, smaller than this room in some cases, but TV, different story, dominated by who? By Disney, which owns ABC and ESPN, which owns NBC Universal, CBS and Paramount and all that, and then Fox, which is part of Sky. That's really the four main firms. You might think, okay, what about Bravo and E and A&E? Those are all owned by those four broadcasting firms. Oh, Time Warner, which owns CNN and broadcast news and all that. It's an oligopolistic industry. There's one example, because it's one that a lot of us can relate to. Somebody at some point in time came up with the yellow line for the first down line in football. I don't know who did it. I think it might have been Fox. I don't know, but once they did it, everyone else followed suit immediately. I mean, immediately everyone had to have that yellow line. And today, if you watch a football game, you're looking for that yellow line. Where's that yellow line? You can cross the yellow line, right? And I was in a pro football game not too long ago, and I really wanted to see that yellow line. I kind of missed it because I'm so used to watching it on TV. But somebody came up with that, and everyone else followed suit. In news, I think it was CNN that first started the scroll at the bottom. Now everybody's got the scroll at the bottom, whether it's MSNBC, which is part of Comcast, whether it's Fox, which is part of Sky, or News Corp, I guess. Sky is part of News Corp, is the parent company. This leading and following is an example of that particular dynamic. So I mentioned this in saying firms are competitive, often intensely so, and they're not cartels. And so let's talk about what cartels are, because I think there's a misunderstanding of what cartels are. Let's define what a cartel is. A cartel is a group of cooperating producers. You might write that down, because I think that probably works its way into an exam question. So cartels are groups of cooperating producers, whereas oligopolies are groups of competing producers. They really are competing, and they really do look at their rivals as rivals, and sometimes as enemies, frankly. I mean, I know that when I was in the banking world, we had 3 major banks in the city I was working. We did not like our competitors at all. If somebody left to go to the competitor, we thought they were leaving to go to the enemy, right? So it's very, and I know that that's not always the case, and certainly in broadcasting, make people jumping around and whatnot. So I realize it's not quite the same way, not quite as parochial as what it used to be. But they're not cartels. Cartels are groups of cooperating producers. Cartels are illegal in the United States. They're illegal in Europe. They're illegal in most places in the industrial world. Because why? Because we value competition on the supply side and not cooperation. If cartels are cooperating, what are they cooperating on? They're cooperating on price, quantity. Price and quantity go together, really. They do. The flip sides of the same coin in this XY axis that we have is the PQ plane. Also on things like distribution and territories and all these kinds of things, they'll divide up markets and whatnot. And I know that we probably have been very ill-served by the press, which keeps talking about these drug organizations as cartels. And it doesn't look like they're cartels to me because they're killing each other. That doesn't look like a group of cooperating producers at all. So I don't know where they get the idea that these drug gangs, like the Sinaloa cartel, is a cartel. It doesn't look very much like a cartel. It's just an organized crime gang, very large gang, size of a corporation, but nonetheless, it's not really a cartel at all. The cartel is an illegal formation in the US and Europe, but not so much in other parts of the world. By the way, there's a very large cartel that's perfectly legal because if it's not illegal, it's legal. By definition, that's the OPEC oil cartel, which is one that's been around for many, many decades. And Americans got to know OPEC very well beginning in the 1970s because they essentially restricted the supply of oil beginning of 1973, mostly as retaliation against the industrial world for Israel in its war against its Arab neighbors. And they found out how successful restricting supply was. It drove the price of oil high. And as a result, everyone became familiar with OPEC. Now, you couldn't form OPEC in the United States because cartels are illegal. But obviously, US law doesn't extend to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Indonesia and Venezuela. And so as a result, it's not even a conspiracy because it's not behind closed doors at all. They meet in public, in open. They get together all the time, talking about how they're going to try to cooperate and control the quantity of oil and therefore drive the price of oil up. Now, here's the problem that OPEC has had is that they're losing market share. They don't have quite the power they used to have. They even brought Russia into it, and they call it OPEC Plus, and that still wasn't enough. And now Russia's been sort of pulled from the herd after its invasion of Ukraine. And so as a result, and the US is pumping more oil than anybody, any other producer in the world. The US is the largest oil producer in the world. I did not think I would live long enough to see that happen. And so that cartel has sort of gotten weak. But the point I want to make, though, is that the oligopolies are not cartels. And even the oil industry is not really oligopolistic either, even though there are only a few producers. You could argue, and I think maybe I did include them as an example, but I think it's arguable in many ways. So cartels are groups of cooperating producers, and they're illegal where formed, when they're illegal. By the way, there was a cartel that existed in a few years ago. They got broken up by the Europeans. It was a vitamin cartel. And I know they don't sound very scary, the vitamin cartel. And it was not human, but it was vitamins for livestock. And they were getting together, rigging the price and quantity of vitamins for livestock. And the Europeans broke that up. And we had a very similar example, cartel formation. Archer Daniels Midland and somebody else were trying to do something. And I forget exactly what happened. There's a sort of a Netflix special on that. I forget, I should remember this, I don't. But ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, got sucked into this. And they paid the price. It was not they should not have gotten involved in that sort of collusion. And collusion is a term that you want to know. It's simply cooperating. It's when competitors cooperate. Collusion is considered to be illegal. But we'll talk about some ways maybe around that a bit. The products may be similar and often nearly identical. I think this is what I've sort of been talking about this earlier by talking about airfare. Airlines are pretty much the same. Broadcast news is pretty much the same, although you might argue that some have more political slant than others, but the form of the product is not different. They all have 1 hour programs with the scroll going at the bottom. If there's some kind of breaking news, they all break away and everybody focuses on one subject. There's a mass shooting somewhere, so they focus on that 24 hours a day for a couple of days. Then they move on to something else. It's the identical form of the product. There's football games. It's always the same model. You've got a professional broadcaster in the booth along with an ex-athlete in the booth. Always. And then on the field, there's usually a female who covers the public. I don't know why that is, and I don't know if that's why that sort of gendered relationship exists, but it does. I mean, I'm not making it up. We all have seen it. It happens over and over. They all copy each other as to what they do. I don't know why they do it either. Why they can't have female broadcasters up in the booth calling the play-by-play. But it simply has not happened in football. So I you get the idea. These products are, they copy each other, they do the same thing. And they do it because they find what works, they stick with what works. And when somebody changes it and they find that it works, whatever the form is, then they all copy it, they do something else, okay? But we get the idea that firms do the same thing over and over again, and as a result, it tends to work. And by the way, even, I will say the cigarette industry has elements of both monopolistic competition and oligopoly, and they all do pretty much the same thing. They all distribute the product the same way. They used to advertise when they used to be able to advertise the same way. And if you ever looked at old advertising, cigarette advertising was almost all identical about how the product was so pleasurable and relaxing and all that. So this idea of copying each other, this strategic interdependence is a key feature. Not so much about the product itself. If the product is similar, it's more about the structure, and there are only a few competitors and they go with what works. Economies of scale are prevalent, and by the way, this is an explanation for why there's a low number of competitors. And it's very similar to the idea of natural monopoly, only not quite on that scale, because it's difficult to get into certain industries in which there are already a sufficient number of competitors, and it's already competitive enough. I can't think of anybody wanting to start an airline right now. It would make absolutely zero sense to start an airline. In fact, the opposite has been going on. Airlines have been buying each other, taking firms off this, competing firms down, not up. I can't imagine anybody starting that, or a competing broadcasting company. Maybe over time, as the world becomes more integrated and then more of us out there, maybe we have a new broadcasting network, but they don't come along very often. So you get the idea of more new banks coming along, not so much really. Very often are highly regulated by government due to their broad impact on the economy. And this is really what Chapter 11 is mostly about, is this idea of regulation and what we do about firms that have market concentration. Concentrated market power in the hands of a few. We have this legal and social conception in mind where we don't like the idea of market power being concentrated. And so as a result, we like competition and not cooperation. The fact of the matter is that oligopoly firms are thought to, at some point, be cooperating, and we don't want that to happen, okay? So let's talk about some characteristics of oligopolies, and this will probably get curious to the end of the period. And it'll be a good stopping point for us to jump into Chapter 11. My feeling was we might get into Chapter 11, but it's not a particularly long chapter, so we're not really too far behind the 8 ball here. So firms are large, and we're often talking about big business. So if you're talking about a small town with 4 veterinarians, that does not really constitute an oligopoly, I don't think. I don't think that veterinarians are looking at each other, finding out what they're doing. Usually we're talking about, those are smaller businesses. I can't imagine that one veterinarian is trying to do something different than everyone else is copying it, and that they're watching each other. I don't think that makes an oligopoly. We're talking about big businesses that dominate big portions of large economies. And that's what constitutes an oligopoly. And we'll give some examples. And there are numerous examples of industries, a lot of which and all of which we know. Not a single one of these we don't know. So they're large, they're what we think of as big business. Not that big business is only oligopoly, because we obviously have monopolies that are big business, monopolistic competition that are big business, but we're talking, this is oftentimes what we've got here is we work our way down to a few competing firms, and then scale acts like a barrier to keep new firms coming in. Maybe not indefinitely. At some point, maybe they get new competitors, but just not in the short run. They often have broadly diversified operations. That is, they often adopt a conglomerate strategy. Now that is true, but that is becoming less true over time. And maybe we could do more time on conglomerates another day, but I don't think so. Conglomerates were really formed after World War II. Conglomerates are basically this, a company with a portfolio of businesses, because after the Great Depression, a lot of firms said, look, we are stuck with whatever industry that we're in. If we're into a depression or a deep recession, we're stuck with that. We're stuck with whatever we're offering. Maybe people don't want it and we go out of business. So therefore, maybe we want something that works against the business cycle. And so maybe we produce durable goods and some inferior goods as well, so that at least we have something to keep generating cash flow and balance out cash flows, earnings and cash flow when the economy goes in an inevitable slump. Today, I don't think we're really worried about a depression ever. I mean, if we were going to have a depression, we probably would have had one in the 08-09 financial crisis when a lot of the banks were going down the tubes. I think we could probably avoid that by stimulus. Not to say we can't avoid a recession, but conglomerate strategies are difficult. The reason they're difficult is because you've got businesses that don't look alike, and they're difficult to manage, and it becomes difficult to manage companies that don't look a lot alike, and they're not because they're meant to balance out cash flows during downturns and upturns both. Today, this is becoming less and less common. In fact, what firms are doing is unwinding these sorts of conglomerate strategies. And so you saw at one point Paramount and Coca-Cola had an ownership partnership that got spun off and doesn't exist anymore. You see other kinds of combinations where the trend is to move away from this and go the other direction. In fact, we're seeing more spin-offs now than anything else. Where firms are breaking themselves up into different pieces because of the fact they're easier to manage. Okay? So, but there is some diversity. There's no question there's diversification. No question about that. Firms experience the negative price effect. The same issue here as with monopolistic competition. Economic profit is possible in the short run and long run as well. Not guaranteed, and if it's not guaranteed in monopoly, it's not guaranteed. Okay, either, although it is the norm, I would say. It's possible in the short run and often in the long run as well. And then again, the profit maximizing quantity is the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And let's give some, we got about 4 minutes here. I think we got a little bit of time. Some of these I've mentioned it. I've given some examples of oligopoly structures, and let's talk about some examples here. Autos and light trucks. And here, I know I mentioned this, and this may be an area where it's a little bit debatable as to whether it's truly oligopolistic or whether it's monopolistic competition. And I think a lot of economists are believing maybe this goes over into monopolistic competition. Whereas it was always first on the list because it was almost the exemplar of oligopoly industry, particularly in the US, because for years we only had 3 main producers. Any other producers were such small fry, they didn't really move the needle at all. But today there are lots of competitors, a lot of them foreign competitors, and so this is a difficult proposition. However, we get into this, motorcycles, jet skis, and snowmobiles, we only have a few producers of all of these particular kinds of brands. Like jet skis, you've got Polaris and Yamaha, and maybe not too many other producers of jet skis and snowmobiles and things like motorcycles. You don't have more than a handful of motorcycle manufacturers out there. So that's an example. Also, aircraft manufacturing of civilian aircraft. You've only got just a few, Beechcraft, Piper, and others, not a whole lot out there. These are obviously big businesses. Consumer electronics. Take something like refrigerators and some of the number of brands of refrigerators out there, you probably can't get above 10. Maytag and Whirlpool and LG, and I'm sure there was Kenmore, and I think we're running sort of down the list. We're almost out of names, really, aren't we? Of consumer, and it's across the spectrum with consumer electronics. Even something like personal computers. If you think about all the brands that have come and gone, all the companies, I should say, have come and gone in personal computers, just in the time that computers have been around, then as personal computers, there are lots of, we're only down to things, we've got a number of small fry out there, but Hewlett-Packard and Apple sort of dominate the game, and IBM used to be a major player, and not so much anymore. And there are companies that are no longer in existence, like Digital and Packard Bell and Wang and some others, and they just don't exist, and because that industry is kind of much more concentrated. And the hardware business is frankly a lot less profitable than the software business, and so they've worked themselves down to just a few competitors. And there are lots of competitors. I know there are a lot of competitors out there for personal computers, but some of them are so small. And we'll see when we talk about how we measure this market power, we'll see that they sometimes don't move the needles. Breakfast cereals, lots of brands, few producers. Post, Kellogg, Quaker are the big names, and they've got multiple brands within them. That's almost another perfect example of how you want to create more brands that sort of go this way and this way across the shelves to keep other competing firms off the market. And the form of those products are almost identical. Post has Raisin Bran and Kellogg's has Raisin Bran. Is it different, or do you really care if you're buying Post Raisin Bran or Kellogg's Raisin Bran? I don't think you really do, because the product is very, very similar and they match price. They're very, very close to one another. They're more higher priced than the generic substitute, but nonetheless, they're out there. Anyway, we'll finish this list when we come back on Monday. We don't have very much to do at all on oligopolies because we've covered a lot. We don't really have to go over and cover these. We don't have to talk about what barriers to entry are and those kind of things. We already covered some of that. So really, it's more describing how this particular industry works. But then some of these dynamics will become clearer, I think, when we get into chapter 11, when we talk about how we measure the degree of market power and what that implies for this all-important issue of regulation. Okay? So any questions for me before we say goodbye on today's class session? All right, well, have a great rest of your day. I will see everybody next week. Have a good weekend soon.